My son particularly wants to know details of what you had for breakfast. What was the spread?
Good morning. We are already late 15 minutes, so we have to begin. Your Excellencies, Reverend Fathers, colleagues, brothers and sisters, it is a great honor that I have now to preside the first session of our conference today. As a chairman, I would feel free to call Father Joshua Lolar to come and give his lecture entitled in our program as Pathos and Technique in St. Maximus the Confessor. As most of you may have already known, Father Joshua is a scholar of Eastern Christianity with specific interests in Greek and Syriac patristic Byzantine culture and theology, and modern Orthodox Christian thought. He studies the encounters between the ancient philosophical and literary traditions of Greece and the early and medieval Christian communities that received them. In his present lecture, Father Joshua will focus on the Maximus analysis of human possibility, pathos, under the light of contemporary question of technology. So, Father Joshua, please give your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Grace. I'm very honored to be here amongst you, such esteemed scholars of Maximus the Confessor. I very much feel the junior colleague of all of you, so thank you for having me in your midst. With this paper, I would like to raise the question of the relationship between pathos and techne in the thought of St. Maximus the Confessor. That is, the relationship between human subjection to external conditions and the technic, even we might say technological, response to that subjection, which Maximus says arose with man's fall into corruption and sin. The textual focus for the paper will be on his Ambigua to John, but I want to allow Maximus's thought to open out onto some of our own contemporary concerns, to present us with some possibilities for our own thought. And so the paper will conclude with a few questions of current interest. The concept of pathos, passion, passibility, being subject to something other than oneself, lies at the heart of St. Maximus the Confessor's understanding of man and of created nature in general. He famously says in Ambiguum 7, pathos exists together with beings by nature. And it is this insight that guides his famous critique of so-called originism in that text. Creation is not stable in its foundations. The unthinkable creation out of nothing implies for Maximus that motion and passivity are the fundamental realities of created being. For human beings, this passivity locates itself in the body and the soul. With respect to the body, Maximus says, and this is the second quotation on your handout, the change and alteration of the body and what is outside the body are common to all human beings. They are both actively and passively involved in motion, and the only steadiness and stability they possess are constant unsteadiness and motion. But this bodily manifestation and experience are simply the epiphany of human being itself to itself in its primordial pathos, the visibility of an invisible motion of being. The body, which comes before me as something that accompanies me, but is other than me, in the words of St. Gregory the theologian, whom Maximus interprets throughout the Ambigua, the body is my yoke mate, my fellow slave, my fellow heir, my fellow worker. The body discloses to me in its pathos the mystery of my own creation and the place from which and in which I call out to God. The soul is in motion for Maximus as well, and this motion is also a pathos. The soul as intellect, as nous, is brought near to God without knowing him. This being brought, literally being moved, of the intellect is a basic pathos of the soul. The soul as sensation, aesthesis, receives the impression of the logi of visible things as from symbols into itself. The soul, like the body, is a dynamic, changeable reality in the world, the place of human pathos and therefore of revelation. Intellect is brought near to God without knowledge. Sensation receives impressions like a wax tablet. Now the soul as reason, as logos, appears to have a more active role in the acquisition of the knowledge of the logi. The soul as logos moves itself in an active acquisition of knowledge of the logi that confer upon it the form of God as the cause of all. But its action is a movement that mediates the pathos of sensation, ultimately to the pathos of the intellect's movement to God. So it is pathos that reveals. The Passion of Christ, the revelation of God to the world, is recapitulated in the being of man itself as body, intellect, reason, and sensation. Indeed, God draws the world into participation with himself through motion, and in pouring himself out into and as the world, pours himself into the dynamic of cosmic pathos, realized as love, which reveals him. The divine, Maximus writes, quotation number 3, exists as absolutely immovable according to essence and nature, since it is boundless, related to nothing, and invisible. It is like a scientific logos, epistemonikos logos, existing in the essences of things, which is said to be moved when it providentially sets into motion the logos of each being, which is each being's natural logos of movement, and without undergoing any change, takes upon itself as cause all of the categories that pertain to what it causes. Following the Dionysian notion of the cause taking on the names of what it causes, Maximus addresses the question of how an absolutely immovable God can cause motion in something else, and more generally, of how we can speak at all of pathos with reference to God. Quoting the divine names, he writes, quotation 4, "Why is it that theologians sometimes call the divine love, eros, and sometimes delight, agape, but at other times they call it the beloved and the delightful?" He decides the matter in this way, Dionysius, because it is in one respect moved and in another produces motion. Now Maximus explains this quotation as follows. Quotation number 5. The divine is moved in that it produces an innate orientation of love and delight in those capable of receiving them. And it produces motion by naturally attracting the desire of those who are moved to it. Again, it produces motion and is itself moved. It thirsts to be thirsted after. It loves to be loved. It delights to be delighted in. Now it's worthwhile to quote the full quotation from Dionysius, from which Maximus takes this. Quotation number 6. In general, why is it that theologians sometimes want to call God love, eros, and sometimes delight, but at other times they call him the beloved and the delightful? Because God is the cause, just as he is the sender and begetter of love and is love itself. And because he is moved towards love and sets love in motion, or because he is himself the one who leads forth and motivates the procession from himself and to himself. In this they call him the delightful and the beloved, as beautiful and good, and love and delight as being the power that at the same time moves and elevates to himself, who alone is the absolutely self-sufficient beauty and good itself, even as he is the manifestation of himself through himself, and the good procession and simple erotic motion of the transcending unity, self-moving, self-actualizing, pre-existing in the good, gushing forth from the good to existing things, and returning again to the good. Both Maximus and Dionysius extend Aristotle's conception of the unmoved mover from the well-known passage in Metaphysics Lambda, in which the unmoved mover is understood to affect motion in everything else as the object of desire, to orektikon, and the object of thought, to noiton. The extension of the idea is precisely that God, the cause of all, is said not only to be the object of love or desire, but also actively to be moved by his love for creation. And this motion is realized in the Dionysian outpouring of goodness to beings and its return, which is the very outpouring and return of God from himself to himself. Hence the language of self-motion, autokinesis. Everything that exists just is the, as it were, motion of God, proceeding from himself and returning to himself. Maximus is able to use the language of motionlessness for God as a consequence of his notion that God is the limit or horizon of the world. We see this in Ambiguum 10. There is nothing outside God that moves him. This fact is observed in the words akiniton, motionless, and apathon, without pathos, without passion. God is not moved passively. All cosmic motion is contained within the cycle of God's procession and return, so that Dionysius is self-moving God, who is the initiator and object of his own self-outpouring, is Maximus's unmoved God, who undergoes no motivation from any world outside himself. Within this grand vision, Maximus focuses particularly on God as the object of desire, understanding, and ultimately praise, arguing in Ambiguum 23 that when Gregory the theologian refers to the monad as being moved to duality and then to trinity, that Gregory is referring to the movement of the intellect, that is, quote, taught to confess, beginning from the Father, continuing to the Son, to confess him together with the Father, and then to receive the Holy Spirit together with the Father and the Son, to worship the perfect Trinity together with the perfect monad, perfect unity. Just as the fullness of the Trinity is progressively revealed through the course of Scripture, as Gregory says in his Oration 31, so too does Maximus affirm that its fullness is revealed progressively to the individual mind, like an art that is slowly mastered by a craftsman, and like light that illuminates the mind, but is also the very goal of the mind's vision itself. Love is the content of the dynamism between God and the world, and this dynamism is recapitulated in the passivity in body and soul of each person. Now, with this question of pathos, we should be aware that Maximus uses the term pathos in two different senses, at least. Ontologically, as I began the paper, a created being, something that has been moved from non-existence into being, just is pathos itself. Its very emergence into being is defined by pathos, in that a creature's ability even to undergo passivities is itself given from outside itself. On the side of ethics or praxis, however, pathos refers to the domination of reason, of logos, by the body and the irrational aspects of the soul, so that apatheia, passionlessness, refers to reason's ascendancy over the irrational. As the elder says at the beginning of Maximus's Liber Asceticus, on the ascetical life, the human being in the state of corruption and death is led along by the manifold passions of the flesh, so that the life of ascetical practice is precisely a therapy of the passions. Apatheia in the life of asceticism is relative. Reason is not subject to, is not moved by the irrational. However, if pathos in the general sense, in which human beings are subject to forces outside of themselves, the weakness of the body and also its recalcitrance with respect to the mind being the most immediate manifestation of this, if this pathos is, as we have seen, a revelation of the pathos at the heart of man's created nature, and therefore the doorway of knowledge to God, then does apatheia on the level of experience imply an interruption of that revelation? Well, we shall return to this question at the conclusion of this paper. At the moment, we can say with certainty that the awareness of pathos is indeed the beginning of philosophy for Maximus, and pathos is experienced as ataxia, as disorder, to atakton, the disorderly, as it is borne along by the material. Maximus gives a significant account of the cause of our current state of disorder and of its rationale in Ambiguum 8. He says, this is quotation number 7, "When man came into being and had been arrayed by God with the beauty of incorruption and immortality, but preferred the coarseness of the material nature that surrounded him to intellectual beauty, he completely forgot the preeminent worthiness of the soul, or rather of God, who adorned the soul with the beauty of the divine form. Man preferred material nature, but precisely material nature as that which surrounded him, that which was periavton. In preferring what was periavton, what was around him, he forgot his own life, forgot God himself. Because in forgetting the worthiness of the soul, the human being forgets the divine form, which is its worthiness. In his current state, man is wrapped in attention to what is periavton, to what is around him, to what surrounds him, and this gives rise to forgetfulness. Attention leads precisely to distraction. This basic interval, periavton, lithi, forgetfulness, introduces, quotation number 8, the corruption and death of the body, and a movement and disposition prone to every passion, and also the instability and irregularity of the material reality that was both outside him and surrounded him. And he became susceptible to changeability and even indifferent to it. This is man's inheritance, the fruit of his attention to the periavton, that which surrounds him, at the expense of intellectual beauty. He is in the world as subject to the world, attacked by the world, and ultimately consumed by the world. Maximus rejects the quasi-originist notion that the providential creation of the world is simply for the sake of training the soul, a view implying that the material world has no integrity of its own. Nevertheless, he does regard the human experience of pathos as pedagogy. The experience of pain and suffering under this mode of thinking teaches the soul and makes it aware of itself, so that it should come to see its superiority to the body. The all-wise provider, he says, of our life often concedes to use what arises in our own impulses for the sake of our moderation. Moderation is not at all the human experience of human impulses in its untrained state. Rather, we frantically make use of impulses through the confusions and disturbances that surround them and come from them. Ormi, impulse in general, and ormis, the particular instances of this drive, are conceived here as realities that pull apart, that scatter and fragment. Confusion and disturbance both surround and derive from the realities that are the concern of ormi, so that by themselves they condition our drives and sensations to confusion and disorder, rather like the account in Plato's Timaeus, in which newly established souls that have not become accustomed to the harmonious and ordered evolutions of the cosmos are disturbed by the disordered sensations that come upon them. Rather than being kept away, however, these confusing and disturbing phenomena are given precisely to provoke the love of what is lovable by nature in place of what we happen to love right now. This dynamic is based upon the conviction that human being naturally tends towards stability, and that when ormi, impulse, finds itself in pursuit of what is unstable, confused, unsatisfying, it will naturally seek to go beyond it towards what abides. All of this is part of the paideia of the passions, a training that results in healing. Therefore, Maximus says, quotation number 9, perhaps the present unevenness of lifestyle has been allowed so that the power of reason in us, which prefers virtue to all else, might be shown. For the change and alteration of the body and what is outside the body are common to all human beings. They are both actively and passively involved in motion, and the only steadiness and stability they possess are constant unsteadiness and motion. It is pathos that reveals logos in a manifestation that comes forth by means of the instability of material life and the inequalities it entails. The motion and pathos of the cosmos and of man within the cosmos bring about the manifestation of the power of logos in its disposition towards virtue. Pathos is the revelation of the word, of logos. Now, part 2, what about techne? The origin of techne for Maximus is man's attempt to shelter himself from this pathos in the world and to provide for his circumstantial needs. And this too reveals a certain mode of logos, that of the technical kind, precisely technology, technologia. He reflects in Ambiguum 45 on Gregory the theologian's teaching that man, anthropos, was from the beginning naked in his simplicity and life without artifice. Adam's life was atechnos, without artifice, without art. Maximus interprets this in a few different ways, but most basically, there is a radical difference between the human body before the transgression of Adam and after. Quotation number 10. Before the trespass, the human being was not torn apart in the constitution of his body by qualities that are contrary to and destructive of each other, but maintained his integrity without their ebb and flow, and was free of the continuous alteration that comes with this ebb and flow, depending on the predominance of one quality or another. After the trespass, man found himself subject to the ebb and flow of elements and qualities. To explain the concept of zoe atechnos, life without artifice, life without the application of techne to the world or to oneself. Maximus writes, quotation 11, "According to this great teacher, the first human being lived without artifice, for he was not causing the natural bodily vigor that had once been essentially given to him to dissipate. He existed without the need for clothing and had no notion of shame because of his inherent dispassion. Neither was he subject to cold and heat, which eventually led men to contrive a way of sheltering themselves with houses and clothing. The mode of embodied life that holds sway in ourselves now is marked precisely by dissipation, by flux. Adam entered that mode when he ate of the forbidden fruit, thinking that his life depended upon the processes of decay and reconstitution for its persistence." Again, we see this in Ambiguum 10. It is this process of dissipation that made a technical, even a technological life to arise, for man now needed to cover his vulnerable body with clothing and houses. Man is now concerned with the logi of the technical arts in order to provide for the needs of life in the midst of his circumstances. Thus, techne is bound up with human necessity, vulnerability, dissipation, ultimately with pathos. Techne is man's attempt to keep himself secure in the midst of his pathos. This is a poignant observation, I think, for the development of technology since the Industrial Revolution has allowed and has perhaps been driven by the aspiration to secure ourselves in a definitive, structural, and final way from our own passivity, to the point where, as the French thinker Hervé Jouvin has recently put it, it is conceivable from the perspective of technological possibilities, that a human being could go through life without ever experiencing any bodily pathos, lack, or discomfort. Quotation from Jouvin. The great novelty of the early 21st century in Europe is that we have just invented a new body, one resistant to need, suffering, and the effects of time. Resistant to the world, too, the world of nature, of destiny. Making due allowance for the rhetoric of this passage, I think we can say that this is the aspiration, at least, of technological man. For Maximus, techne arose to protect the body from its subjection to the harshness of the climate and to secure bodily needs. It is also related to the technical fabrication of a certain form of the self through the techniques of asceticism and virtue. In both cases, we find the application of method and the production of structure. Maximus refers this dynamic to knowledge as well, knowledge of the world in natural contemplation, theoria physici, and the knowledge of divine realities, the things after God. Man's original nakedness in this context consisted in his freedom from the contemplation of knowledge, contemplation and knowledge of nature that is characterized by multiplicity. As man now is, he must approach a world of multiplicity in a way characterized by multiplicity, in terms of the categories of understanding, if you like. However, Maximus envisions a primordial state in which, quotation number 12, in which man did not need first to think in terms of the phenomena that appear to the senses in order to come to an understanding of divine things. For he had as his simple covering only the uniform, simple, and constitutive virtue and knowledge that pertain to the things after God, which needed only to be brought to actualization in order to be made manifest as independent realities. While he speaks specifically here of divine things, he also intends to point to a vision without the dominance of the techniques of the contemplation of nature. Because, as he writes, the first created man was wise. He was established in a state beyond the contemplation of nature because of his knowledge, and as such, had nothing mediating God to him. As things stand now, however, with the transgression of Adam, human knowledge is a species of technology. The transgression of Adam and his falling subject to the world and his own pathos resulted in a sort of scientific revolution, to use Thomas Kuhn's phrase, in which man's thinking turned to a multiplicity of phenomena for the gathering of sense data, which, in a techne of cognition, leads to knowledge of the world and ultimately to divine things. This is Maximus's way of indicating that human cognition is itself bound up with pathos of change, of revolution. Now, the question to pose in conclusion is this. Given man's desire to secure himself from his own pathos and subjection to the world, and given modern man's technological prowess and partial realization of this through technological means, is Maximus's basic vision of philosophical and spiritual life, which is grounded in human pathos, and more precisely in man's awareness of his pathos, is this comprehensible to us today, to technological man, as an aspiration? Now, there is an enormous amount of pathos in the world, realized precisely as suffering. But I think Jouvin is right to identify the aspiration towards technological passionlessness as constitutive of our current aspirations in Europe and North America, and indeed in most industrialized nations around the world. What does this mean for Maximus's notion of apatheia? Does the aspiration towards a technologically induced apatheia entail the replacement of Maximus's ascetical apatheia and the loss of the revelation through experiential pathos of the ontological pathos of man, and therefore of his creation and his creator, who has himself entered the realm of pathos? It is the experience of pathos that elicited Gregory the theologian's questioning of himself. What is the wisdom concerning me? What is this great mystery? Does techne, in its aspiration to fabricate an artificial Eden in which man is not or no longer subject to nature, finally eradicate this revealing and revelatory question? It is something of a truism that technological innovation is always running ahead of reflection upon technology. This is perhaps inevitable, but it should also motivate us to think more deeply about the essence of technology. The scriptures are rather ambivalent about human techne. It is the sons of Cain, after all, who originate metal tools, musical instruments, and cities. In raising the question of the relationship between Maximus's understanding of pathos as revelation and his teaching on the origin of techne, I hope to have indicated a possibility for thought that St. Maximus has provided to us, or at least to have raised a problem in good Maximian style. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Joshua. He explained us what is the relationship between pathos and techne in St. Maximus, and he showed us that pathos exists together with human nature. Thank you for your words. We will have opportunity to discuss after the next two speakers. Izvinjavam se i onima koji slušaju prevod s engleskog na srpski, zato što u početku nije funkcionisao prevod. Ne znam da li u međuvremenu se prevod pojavio, ako nije, nadam se da će biti prevoda. Jel ima prevoda? Ima. Okay, so we can proceed now to our next speaker, the young professor at Fordham University, Aristotelos Papanikolaou. In our modest milieu, it is already well known that areas of Papanikolaou's expertise are Trinitarian Orthodox theology and religion in public life, mostly expressed in his recent publication, Being with God, Trinity, Apophaticism, and Divine Human Communion. As from the researcher in this area, it would be of great importance to hear his lecture entitled as Learning How to Love St. Maximus on Virtue. So, please, Mr. Papanikolaou, tell us
Thank you, Grace.
Your lecture.
After centuries of domination by deontological and utilitarian ethics, what is being called virtue ethics in Europe and North America has experienced a revival over the last 2 decades. This revival is often traced to Elizabeth Anscombe's 1958 article, Modern Moral Philosophy, in which she launches a scathing critique on both deontological and utilitarian ethics. Anscombe's efforts to revive a virtue form of ethics within both philosophical and theological ethics would not bear fruit until the publication of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue in 1981. Since then, there has been increasing attention to what has been called virtue ethics as an alternative to deontological and utilitarian ethics. In the limited amount of literature I have read on virtue ethics, it seems to me that although virtue ethics has emphasized the contextuality of both moral decision-making and moral action, it tends to slide towards deontology in that the emphasis is still on discerning the rule in a given context. Where virtue ethicists are hesitant is in offering a thick understanding of what it means to be human, which could then ground their understanding of the relation between virtues and the good inherent to being human. In After Virtue, Alistair MacIntyre famously argued that what divided modern and pre-modern ethics is that pre-modern ethics was based on a threefold structure of untutored human nature as it happens to be. That's the first part of the structure. Human nature as it is. That is the second. And I'm sorry, let me go back. So the first part of the structure is of untutored human nature as it happens to be. The second is human nature as it could be if it realized its telos. And the third is the precepts of rational ethics as the means for the transition from one to the other. So the transition of untutored human nature as it happens to be to human nature as it could be if it realized its telos. Modern ethics, he argues, eliminated the second element of this structure, which is human nature as it could be if it realized its telos, and as a result is both incoherent and destined to fail insofar as it attempts to retain the precepts of pre-modern ethics while eliminating the teleological framework within which those precepts developed. While there has been discussion within virtue ethics about the goods inherent to being human, philosophical virtue ethicists, including MacIntyre himself, have been less successful and almost hesitant about providing a thick and well-grounded notion of human nature as it could be if it realized its telos. Providing a conception of human nature as it could be if it realized its telos is not a problem for Christian theological virtue ethics. Virtue ethics within Christian thought have almost entirely focused on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. An important discussion over the past 2 decades has been the relation between the cardinal and the theological virtues in Aquinas. The cardinal virtues are those acquired in which the human realizes her natural end. The theological virtues are those infused by God as gift, in which the human realizes his supernatural end, which is knowledge of God and charity. In virtue ethics in Aquinas, there's no question that virtue is linked to a thick understanding of the human telos. What is complicated to understand in Aquinas is the relation between two distinct, though not separated, teli for the human. Before I speak about St. Maximus, let me admit that I have been convinced by recent literature that has affirmed that both Aquinas and his predecessor by many centuries, Augustine, believed that the human was created for theosis. Put another way, I disagree with the idea that what separates Aquinas from the Greek fathers is that Aquinas rejected the idea of deification. Rather than seeing a diametrical opposition between the East and the West, I would rather frame the difference as one of conceptualities within the common framework or belief that the human was created for union with God. Now, with that said, I do think there is a point of difference between Thomistic virtue ethics as transmitted through the Catholic tradition and the virtue ethics of the ascetical tradition as developed in the thought of St. Maximus the Confessor. It should be noticed that the revival of virtue ethics within philosophical and theological ethics has almost entirely focused on the thought of Aristotle and Aquinas. It is often argued that the best insights of the ascetical tradition were folded into Aquinas' synthesis. This assessment is inaccurate, and the time is now ripe to interrupt the current discussions of philosophical and theological virtue ethics with the tradition of thinking on virtue in the ascetical tradition, and most especially the thought of St. Maximus the Confessor. St. Maximus and Aquinas agree that the telos of the human is to be more loving, to learn how to love, which is embodied deification. Thomistic virtue ethics, however, over the centuries, increasingly divided the natural from the supernatural end, so so as to render the impression that the virtue of love is an infused gift from God that is absolutely unrelated to any kind of human action or practices, or to human so-called natural end. The separation has affected the Christian approach to social ethics. What is unclear and endlessly debated in the tradition of Thomistic virtue ethics is the relations between practices, the cardinal virtues, and the virtue of love. It is the interrelation between practices, virtues, and St. Maximus doesn't restrict himself to the cardinal virtues, and the manifestation of the virtue of love as the telos of the human, that St. Maximus can offer a substantive contribution to current discussions in virtue ethics. In what follows, I wish to briefly outline some elements of St. Maximus' understanding of the virtues as related to the virtue of virtues, which is love. I want to end with some suggestions for how and why St. Maximus' account of the virtues makes a difference, especially in the human experience of violence. In the writings of St. Maximus the Confessor, communion with God, which is an embodied presencing of the divine, is simultaneous with the acquisition of virtue. Virtue is embodied deification. Within the Greek patristic texts, and I would also argue in Augustine, deification means that if God is love, then the human was created to love, and this love is simultaneously uniting oneself with God, since God is love. As St. Maximus himself says in his second letter, which is addressed to John, quote, "And the divine and blessed love, which is fashioned from these and through which these come to be," and by these he means the virtues, "will embrace God and manifest the one who loves God to be God himself." And this comes from the remarkable translation provided by Father Andrew Louth. In his ascetical writings in particular, St. Maximus discusses a trajectory of the manifestation of virtues through ascetical practices toward the manifestation of the virtue of virtues, which is love. For St. Maximus, the human is created to learn how to love, and is in constant battle against that which weakens the capacity to love. Virtue for St. Maximus is not a building of character for character's sake. It is not a state of being where one displays one's virtues like badges of honor. It is not simply the basis for proper moral decision-making within a particular context, although it is that. The acquisition of virtue is the precondition for enabling the human capacity to love. As St. Maximus says in his 400 chapters on love, quote, "All the virtues assist the mind in the pursuit of divine love," end quote. And as I said, St. Maximus does not restrict himself to only the four cardinal virtues, but consistent with the Eastern Christian patristic tradition, gives a wider catalog of virtue and vices that correspond to the three parts of the soul, the sensible, the irascible, and the rational. The hermeneutical key to St. Maximus is complicated detailing of the relation of virtues and vices to the inner life of the human person and to human agency is, quote, "to progress in the love of God," end quote, which is measured ultimately by how one relates to others, especially those to whom one feels hatred or anger. As St. Maximus explains, quote, "The one who sees a trace of hatred in his own heart through any fault at all, toward any man, whoever he may be, makes himself completely foreign to the love of God, because love for God in no way admits of hatred for man," end quote. If virtues are embodied deification, the precondition for the learning of the virtue of virtues, which is love, then vices compare the capacity for love. St. Maximus explains that, quote, "The purpose of divine providence is to unify by an upright faith and spiritual love those who have been separated in diverse ways by vice." He elaborates that vice that separates you from your brother includes envying and being envied, hurting and being hurt, insulting or being insulted, and suspicious thoughts, end quote. St. Maximus is also astute to know that vice breeds vice, that it is not simply the doing of vice that harms the capacity for love, it is being viced upon. Quote, "The things which destroy love are these: dishonor, damage, slander, either against faith or against conduct, beatings, blows, and so forth, whether these happen to oneself or to one's relatives or friends, end quote. Vices produce and are such effective emotions as anger, hatred, and fear. And throughout his writing, St. Maximus is attempting both to advise and exhort a form of training that can overcome what are ultimately corrosive emotions, no matter how justified. Also relevant is St. Maximus' discussion of the relation of images to the cultivation of vices and virtues. According to St. Maximus, what often incites and reifies a vice are images or thoughts that present themselves to the human person. St. Maximus explains that, quote, love and self-mastery keep the mind detached from things and from their representations. The whole war of the monk against demons is to separate the passions from the representations, end quote. St. Maximus also warns that when, quote, insulted by someone or offended in any matter, then be aware of angry thoughts, lest by distress they sever you from love and place you in the region of hatred, end quote. In terms of images that incite vice, this resistance is not a removal of the image, but a disabling of its power to evoke such feelings of anger or hatred. To be virtuous is to experience in the face of images the emotions and desires that cultivate authentic relationships. Insofar as virtue is related to love, then virtues build relationships of intimacy, trust, compassion, empathy, friendship, sharing, caring, humility, and honesty. All that is apparently threatened by the experience of vice, which destroys relationships. According to St. Maximus, the acquisition of virtue is a training realized in and through the certain practices that forms the body and the inner life, the soul of the human person. Virtue is a wiring of the self as openness to love. In addition to interrupting the status quo in virtue ethics, St. Maximus' understanding of virtue is especially relevant to the human experience of violence, such as the experience of war. In the ethics of war, the emphasis in Christian thought has been on just war theory. The Orthodox have proudly boasted that, of course, against the West, that it never developed a just war theory. I have yet to read, however, an Orthodox theologian to think about war from the perspective of theosis. And here I would argue St. Maximus can help us. It is very common in the United States now to hear of stories of combat soldiers from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. One hears horrible stories of combat veterans who have a difficult time simply being with their wives, their children, their friends, in bars, restaurants, social groups that give most of us some pleasure. They have a hard time keeping jobs, and many of them end up homeless on the American streets. They are plagued by demonic images and memories of the war. There are many, many stories that I could give here, but I will restrict myself to the story of the combat veteran John, who was fighting with his fiancée about bus schedules. The argument escalated to the point where John became enraged and went into what is clinically called a berserk state. He took a knife and he cut his fiancée many times. After he awoke in the hospital, he could not remember what he did. And the first thing he asked was, "Did I kill my daughter?" Which he did not. In John's situation, what we see are two of the key vices that, according to St. Maximus, get in the way of love, vices that emerge from being viced upon. And these vices are fear and anger. We don't see self-love here as much as self-hatred and self-loathing. Combat soldiers are trained to kill, to treat all others as threats. This training becomes intensified when in the combat situation where the body is training itself to protect itself. In addition to the constant fear of violence, which can only provoke the feeling of anger, combat soldiers are put in situations where they must inflict violence, often on innocent non-combatants. What emphasis on just war theory does in the ethics of war is to fail to account for the effects of violence on the combat veteran's capacity to love self in the proper way, and to love the other, even the enemy or the stranger. This effect occurs on the combat veteran even if it is clear that they are fighting on the supposedly just side of the war, such as World War II. The mistake that just war theory makes is not so much trying to establish criteria for thinking about justified uses of violence, but implying that simply because one is on the so-called just side of a war, that his relationship with God is unaffected. Whether one is on the just or unjust side, the combat veteran's experience of violence will affect his relationship with God insofar as it affects his capacity to love. If one is impaired in the ability to love, one is impaired in one's ability to be gifted theosis. Jonathan Shea, one of the pioneers in the United States in treating combat veterans suffering from PTSD, describes the effects of the violence of war on the combat soldier in terms of, quote, the ruin of good character, end quote. And more recently, a new clinical diagnosis has emerged, which is called moral injury, which attempts to describe the particular effects of violence on the human. If we follow St. Maximus, which I think we should, this ruin of good character and moral injury must be understood in terms of the diminished capacity to love. The effects of violence on the human is also clearly visible in the poor neighborhoods in the big cities of the United States, and I'm sure of Europe, where the threat of violence is constant. One teenager who lived in a poor neighborhood of Chicago, which is infested with violent gangs, described his neighborhood as a daily war zone. Related to this, one of the most difficult questions confronting educators in the United States is how to educate children in poor neighborhoods who are consistently underperforming in comparison with children in more middle-class or affluent neighborhoods. Paul Tough has recently authored the book, How Children Succeed: Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, in which he reports on approaches to this problem that focus on character, such as the recent work and studies of the Nobel Prize economist from the University of Chicago, James Heckman. Tough describes how educators for decades were focusing on improving what are called cognitive skills, which have to do with such things as reading and mathematics. Studies have shown that the skills correlated with success in such things as college graduation or well-paying job are what are called non-cognitive skills. It is the development of non-cognitive skills that allow for the development of cognitive skills. And examples of non-cognitive skills are self-control, impulse control, anger management, delayed gratification, or thinking before making a bad decision. And if you have not noticed already, these sound a lot like St. Maximus's virtues. What they have also discovered is that the stress from adverse experiences in childhood, such as the experience of violence or the threat of violence, can prevent non-cognitive skills from developing properly. If a child has experienced 4 or more adverse effects as a child, she is 32 times likely to develop learning problems. If a child is experiencing the constant threat of violence in the home, the stress that such a threat generates can prevent the development of the part of the brain responsible for non-cognitive skills. Another way it was explained is this, and this for me adds new meaning to the story of Saint Seraphim of Sarov in the forest with the bears. If one is in the forest and is confronted by a bear, then the part of the brain responsible for aggression will activate, and that part of the brain responsible for reading and writing will deactivate in order for the person to prepare for an emergency response. Such an emergency response, however, is meant to be infrequent. For some children living in a family home situation in which the threat of violence is constant, the brain responds as if facing a bear every single day. If the emergency response of the brain is activated repeatedly, the brain forms pathways, habits, virtues, that get increasingly ingrained. In day-to-day situations, this means that it is difficult for such children to learn reading and mathematics in class when the brain is constantly on emergency response mode. It also explains why such children are plagued with 2 of the vices that St. Maximus says get in the way of love: fear and anger. it is not uncommon for such children to have behavioral problems in school that often manifests itself in rage. Being surrounded by or experiencing violence can actually form the brain in such a way as to form the vices of fear and anger. Again, not necessarily self-love as much as self-loathing. These vices are impairing the ability to be in the kind of relationships that would not simply allow for love to occur, but to allow for learning to occur. What was also interesting about these studies is that it is being shown how proper attachment to a parent or parents can help a child manage the stress of adverse situations. In other words, the development of proper relations through the virtues can counter the vices formed through the experience or threat of violence. What's most hopeful is that these non-cognitive skills can be learned even throughout adulthood. In other words, the human was created in such a way that these non-cognitive skills can be learned no matter what the age of a person. What is really remarkable about all this, at least for me, is the connection between all these studies are showing with all that St. Maximus says about the interrelation between the manifestation of virtues and contemplation. What I have attempted to suggest in this paper is that St. Maximus' account of virtue can disrupt the current status quo in both philosophical and theological virtue ethics by offering a thick understanding of the human telos as one that entails learning how to love. And while Thomistic virtue ethics provides a thick understanding of the human self, the nature-grace divide that haunts Thomistic virtue ethics separates love from the natural good inherent to being human, and which leads to an emphasis on social justice in terms of human rights to social goods such as health care, just wages, etc. I think St. Maximus' account can and should affirm all that should be affirmed, but more. It can offer an account of virtue that can both illuminate the effects of violence and poverty on being human, specifically on the human capacity to love and to form relationships. It can contribute to the interdisciplinary effort of understanding how the cultivations of virtues leads to human flourishing in areas such as education, or how the cultivations of virtues mitigates the effects of violence and poverty. St. John Chrysostom once said that even the poor need virtue. And St. Maximus helps us to understand this comment in the sense that what is distinctive about an orthodox social ethics for today goes well beyond simply helping the poor during a time of need or advocating for systemic change. By never wavering in its understanding of the human being as being created to learn how to love, a Christian social ethics offers the very wisdom of the practices needed to form the human being and the virtues that will allow the human to mitigate the effects of poverty and violence and enable the person to learn how to love, which is nothing less, according to St. Maximus, than the experience of God. If poverty and violence potentially depersonalize and render the human being faceless, then the ascetical practice that manifests the virtues and that enable the capacity to love, or of virtue ethics, are absolutely essential for the realization of the person as a Eucharistic being in the world that is free, ecstatic, and irreducibly unique, hypostatic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Papanikolaou. First of all, because he, through the St. Maximus, explained us what is difference of understanding of love between Western tradition and St. Maximus, and together with St. Maximus, with all Eastern tradition, Orthodox Church. And that he showed us that human being is created for the love and to learn how to love, and that love is not something later added to human being. And especially thank you because he connected the thoughts of St. Maximus with our modern temptations and problems connected with violence and different kind of problems of understanding of love as only psychological subject. So thank you again, we will have opportunity also in discussion to hear a little bit more about his topic. So now we proceed to Mr. Adam Cooper, researcher at John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. His theme is St. Maximus on the mystery of marriage and the body. The following Cooper's lecture is very important because it, first of all, shows that Christianity is deeply interested in the body, in its central mysteries, creation, incarnation, and resurrection. The body and human flesh are radically implicated. Bodies are persons, and persons are spiritual beings, bearers of the divine image. Once again, let us hear how St. Maximus, a monk, taught on the mystery of marriage.
Thank you, Your Grace. It's a real privilege to be here in Belgrade for this marvellous symposium, and I'm thankful again to Bishop Maxim and the organisers for organising it, for inviting me all the way from Australia. Professor Daly had the distinction of being a person who was at the earlier conference in 1980. Perhaps I have the distinction of having travelled the furthest, I'm not sure, but we'll see. What I have to present to you today is really just a snippet, a small portion of a much longer study that I've prepared in preparation for this symposium, and hopefully, if and when proceedings are published, I'll have a chance to fit it into a broader context. Bishop Maxim invited me to reflect, in some respects very personally, upon the impact of Maximus's theology on my own theology of the body, my own incarnational theology, and it has had a profound and deep impact upon me. But I won't go into that story here. In my paper, I seek to contextualize an analysis of a few texts on marriage, on sexuality, on body, that we find in Maximus, to contextualize them within the tradition of Christian thought and reflection upon the human body and upon theology of sexuality. Also to contextualize it within my own sort of formation and development in my theology on these topics. But I also seek to contextualize it in two other respects. One, in relation to the work of the Institute at which I work as a lecturer and a researcher, the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family in Melbourne, connected with the institute founded by Pope John Paul II in Rome in 1981. He said that the future of humanity passes by way of the family. Just reflecting on Aristotle's presentation just now, we could even rephrase it and say the theosis of humanity passes by way of the family, if indeed the family is the nexus, the core, the context in which formation of virtue first takes place, the formation towards love. But the second context in which I want to reflect on is the very confused and hypersexualized culture of contemporary society, Western society, but increasingly more than just the West. And it seems to me that this is a problem that stares the Church and stares Christianity in the face and has to be engaged and tackled head on. It's also concerning that within this hypersexualization of contemporary culture, there are moves afoot by various theologians to exploit Maximus and as an ally for a kind of revisionist moral theology, to exploit in particular his understanding of the male and female sexual difference as merely a provisional gift from God that has, if you like, is permanently kind of ambivalent and always is tinged with a kind of negative flavour. And it seems to me that that aspect of Maximus's thought has increasingly been fastened upon by theologians pressing a revisionist theological not only a moral theology, but a theological vision altogether. And again, I guess my concern in my exposition of the texts for today is to, in some respects, again, to engage with the exegesis of such theologians and to provide a rigorous response from Maximus in keeping with his intuitions, but also perhaps that needs to go beyond Maximus to draw more widely on the resources of the Christian tradition. So, in the light of all that, I'd like to examine a number of key texts, and I've given you a handout with a number of sort of structural diagrams on it. I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them during this session, but that may help just in the way I unpack some of the texts. These are texts which I didn't develop at length in the book I published on the body and St. Maximus, and so they've become important to me. A couple of them I simply didn't think were that important to include. Another, I simply, the Ambiguum 10 one, didn't realise its importance, and that's been alerted to me since I published that work. So I've reconsidered these texts now in the light of a number of years of development on my own part, and in the light of these new contextual questions which I'm raising. So I start with the passage, Centuries on Love 2:30. I'd like to make some comments about that first of all. In Centuries on Love 2:30, Maximus describes how the bodily reality of sexual difference is regarded by the person who has become perfect in love. The person who has become perfect in love. Such a person, he says, pays no attention to the difference between male and female, but fixing his attention upon the one nature of human beings, he regards all equally and is equally disposed towards all. For with him, says Maximus, there is not Greek and Jew, nor male and female, nor slave and free, but Christ is all in all. This moral application of the principle enunciated by St. Paul in Galatians 3:28, often as here in Maximus conflated with Colossians 3:11, is common in the Confessor's writings and relies, I think, on three related principles. First, it locates human nature created in the image of God primarily in the soul and not in the body. Second, it identifies Christ as a universal anthropological archetype from whom all human beings receive their definitive identity from God. And third, it finds the paradigm of perfect love in God's equal love for all human beings, no matter what their particular bodily state or moral condition. From this, we're prompted to ask Maximus whether perfect love is possible within the context of the conjugal vocation. If the attainment of perfect love requires the Christian to relate to other people on the basis of the one universal nature shared in common by all human beings, holding it in focused contemplation in abstraction from all such particular accidents as bodily sexual difference, how, we may ask, can a Christian husband and wife also strive to attain such love without ceasing to relate to one another as sexually distinct persons? Well, before I try and answer that question, I turn to another text a little further on in the Centuries on Love to see if it might contribute to understanding this problem. I refer to Centuries on Love 2:33, and here is where I'll start to provide a kind of schematic outline. Christian tradition has always affirmed the inherent connection between the so-called unitive and procreative dimensions of marriage. But within the broad parameters of this tradition, there has sometimes been disagreement over the question whether conjugal intercourse is legitimate apart from a positive, deliberate intention to procreate. In one of the most well-known Maximian texts on this matter, Centuries on Love 2:33, it seems that Maximus simply affirms the view that for spouses to desire sexual relations without also intending to procreate is to give rein to an evil passion that runs contrary to reason. But a closer examination of the structure of this passage by comparison with the paragraph that is before it, reveals, I think, a more complex and subtle doctrine. The two paragraphs, 232 and 233, are structured in parallel triadic form. And I refer you now to the first diagram. Left-hand side of the column, motivations towards the good. The right-hand side of the column indicates motivations towards evil. On the left-hand side, we have natural inclinations, impulse motivating us towards good, the holy angels motivating us towards good, and goodwill motivating us towards good. While on the other side, motivations towards evil arise from the passions, from the demons, and from bad will. Now, according to this schema, the passions, tapathe, are structured antithetically alongside the natural inclinations, ta physica spermata. The natural inclinations are those innate dynamisms at work in human beings that spontaneously propel them towards doing good. Maximus gives two examples: the moral inclination to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, and the spontaneous stirring of compassion when we see someone in need or distress. One could say that these natural inclinations express an inner logos or rationale proper to human nature. By contrast, the passions propel us towards evil insofar as they motivate us to desire something contrary to reason. This phrase, contrary to reason, paralogon, holds the key to understanding the three examples that Maximus provides. The first is the desire for food outside the proper time or need. The second is the desire for a woman outside the purpose of procreation or for one who is not lawfully ours. The third is when we are enraged or grieved unreasonably towards someone who has offended or hurt us. We can schematize the repeated use of this preposition para in these sentences as follows. Second schema: we desire paralogon, contrary to reason, when we want food, against the time and against the need, or contrary to the proper time and need, or when we want a woman, contrary to the purpose of procreation, or when we are enraged, paratoikos, against, contrary to some reasonable rationale or reason. This is the structure of the text. Well, what do these structural features tell us? I think there are two important points to be made. First, from the fact that Maximus contrasts the passions with the natural inclinations, we may discern an implicit affirmation of certain affective and emotional dynamisms inherent in the human condition that, when properly ordered, are not in themselves contrary to reason, but are in fact expressive of the logos of human nature. Second, from the negative fact that desire for a woman outside the purpose of procreation is contrary to reason, the inference can arguably be drawn that as long as a man's desire for sexual intimacy includes and does not deliberately exclude this skopos of procreation, it expresses a legitimate logos or rationale, not perhaps the primordial logos of human nature, but the provisional logos on account of which God introduced sexual difference. Of course, other factors need to be taken into consideration, including the confessor's own question whether or not the man and woman concerned are lawfully married. But ultimately, it seems to me, it is Maximus's view that the desire of a man for a woman propels him towards evil only if and when that desire runs contrary to certain goals and conditions. In itself, the desire is not evil or contrary to reason. Thus, it seems we are justified in invoking Maximus's authority in order to predicate to sexual desire a certain inner rationale or logic. I'm afraid to call it a logos, but a logic, a rationale at least, which at the very least consists in some formal sense in its procreative finality. In light of these comments, it's possible to propose a third table, and this is the third schema, in which we schematize the operation of desire not negatively, but positively, that is, as it moves us in a direction not paralogon, but katalogon, in keeping with reason. And so this is my proposal. This doesn't come from Maximus, but it's a reverse table of the previous one. We desire katalogon when we want food, kataton keron e kataten chrean. When we want a woman, kataton skopontes paidapoias. Or when we are enraged, kata to ekos. With this analysis, we are one step closer to resolving the issue raised earlier, namely whether a Christian husband and wife can actualize perfect love within the context of their conjugal relations. But there is yet another text we still need to consider, and that is the difficulties to John chapter 10, the 10th ambiguum, part 31. The crowning importance of this passage for the proper appraisal of Maximus's doctrine on marriage and spiritual life was brought to my attention recently by Romanian priest and scholar in Australia, Doru Costachie, in a soon-to-be-published study. In it, Maximus presents a series of 8 typological reflections by which he attempts to unravel the significance of the appearance of Moses and Elijah alongside Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration. Why was Moses there? Why was Elijah there? What did that mean, is the question. In each case, Moses and Elijah typify a pair of contrasting yet related elements, which find their unifying centre in the incarnate Word who stands between them. The 8 types or figures are as follows, and again, now I've schematized this. Moses on one side, Elijah on the other, the incarnate Word in the middle. Moses represents the legal word, wisdom, knowledge, praxis, marriage, death, and time. Elijah, on the other hand, represents the prophetic word, kindness, education, contemplation, celibacy, life, and nature. My focus is limited in the first instance to the 5th typological pair, according to which Moses and Elijah respectively symbolize the mysteries of marriage and celibacy. Through the appearance of Moses and Elijah on either side of Jesus on the mountain, writes Maximus, the apostles learned that the mysteries concerning marriage and celibacy are from the Word, the Logos. Through Moses, in that he was not prevented by marriage from becoming a lover of the divine glory, and through Elijah, in that he remained utterly pure from marital union. In this way, God, the Word, declared that those who by reason keep these things straight in accordance with the laws divinely laid down concerning them are mystically introduced to himself. We note in this passage, first of all, that both marriage and celibacy are said to contain mysteries, and that these mysteries in some way derive from the Word, and indeed mystically lead to him. Second, we note that the special lesson to be learned from Moses is that his marriage was no obstacle to his spiritually erotic search for and encounter with the divine glory. This claim may come over as a surprise. We might well have expected Maximus to express the traditional conviction, already articulated in the New Testament, that marriage divides a Christian's interests. A married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he should please his wife, and his interests are divided. So writes St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. Instead, Maximus allows that being a lover of one's wife and being a lover of the divine glory need not involve mutually exclusive pursuits. Moses' conjugal state and vocation did not dissipate his yearning to behold the Lord in his glory. The third point to note, also indicated by Costachie, is that the successful fulfillment of either vocation, whether marriage or celibacy, a fulfillment which leads to Christ, depends upon the governing role of reason and the laws established by God. Well, So far, the analysis has been limited to just that fifth typological pair, marriage and celibacy, and as such it seems to yield a very positive portrait of marriage. And that's the conclusion that Kostaki draws from this text. Both vocations, marriage and celibacy, find their unity and goal in orientation to Christ the Word. Both are legitimate paths to union with God's glory. However, when we take in the wider context of this passage and compare the fifth pair to the other pairs in the schema, the other 7, a comparison which, given the structural unity of the entire typological schema, seems quite appropriate, it seems to me that a number of qualifications to this positive portrait are called for. Moses is a type not only of marriage, but also of the legal word, wisdom, knowledge, praxis, death, time, and the sensible realm. Elijah is a type not only of celibacy, but also of the prophetic word, kindness, education, contemplation, life, nature, and the intelligible realm. If we accept some kind of mutually illuminating relation between marriage and the other categories typified by Moses, and between celibacy and the other categories typified by Elijah, then it seems that Maximus's depiction of marriage in this passage can be fully understood only in light of its association with the realm of time, work, struggle, and death. This stands in contrast to celibacy, which the confessor associates with the realm of eternity, rest, contemplation, and life. True enough, the appearance of Moses and Elijah together with Christ is for Maximus proof that the Word is the Lord of both life and death, and that no one at all is dead with him. Moses, the married preacher of divine law, may have died and missed out on entering bodily into the promised rest, while Elijah, the celibate preacher of divine mercy, may have been translated directly to heaven. But to both it has been granted to appear alongside the incarnate Word in his transfigured glory. At the same time, it seems appropriate to attend to the way Maximus structures the marriage-celibacy pair within the entire eightfold typology, noting especially the way he concludes the typologies with the contrast between the sensible and the intelligible. I quote, "Of these, Moses offers the meaning of the sensible, that it is subject to change and corruption, as his history of it shows, declaring its origination and death. Elijah, by contrast, offers the meaning of the intelligible, which does not await an end of its existence defined by corruption, for it is naturally imperishable, having received this from God, who willed to create it as such." Understood in light of its structural and symbolic connection with the sensible, marriage belongs to the realm of corruption and death, or in the words of St. Paul, to the form of this world that is passing away. Celibacy, on the other hand, belongs to the world of eternity, to the world of the kingdom and the resurrection, where, in the words of Jesus, we shall be like the angels. From this, I think it is fair to conclude that if we limit our interpretation of this text only to what Maximus says about marriage and celibacy in the fifth typological pair, then we can say that he explicitly favours neither marriage nor celibacy over the other. But if we widen our interpretation of the fifth typological pair to take into account the context of the entire parallel schema, then celibacy clearly emerges as superior. Whichever interpretation we prefer, nonetheless, 2 points remain constant and undisputable. First, marriage is a mystery whose ultimate meaning is found in Christ. And 2, being married does not in itself prevent a person from becoming a lover of the divine glory. I'd like now to move to a conclusion. From the text that I've adduced, and indeed in the fuller version of this study, I look at a few more and try and draw them into synthesis in the conclusion. I think there are 3 kind of key points that we can draw out. First, it seems that perfect love takes its measure from the universal love of God for all people, without regard for distinctions of sex, race, status, or moral quality. Second, the inclination towards sexual intimacy, when rightly deployed, expresses a legitimate rationale or logos, not the logos of human nature generically considered per se, but the provisional logos specific to our sexually differentiated state. And third, faithful commitment to the marital vocation does not hinder an authentic spiritual orientation towards holiness. Marriage is relativized by the mystery of Christ, yet it also receives its true meaning and purpose from him. But are these points enough to exonerate the confessor from the charge once laid down by Hans Urs von Balthasar, that in Maximus's theology, sexuality is too overloaded by the tragedy and the despairing dialectic of original sin to find a positive place among the syntheses achieved by Christ? And it's not only the awkward comments on other passages that von Balthasar has in mind. In the end, he said, Maximus considers sexual desire and the passions as a sort of sacrament of sin, in that even here an external gesture, in itself neither good nor evil, has become an efficacious sign of sin. I think to respond to that would take us too far afield for today. Let me try and wrap it up in just a few final words. It seems quite clear that Maximus almost invariably limits the significance of sexual difference to the temporal sphere, discerning in its features more a legacy of sensual corruption than any kind of proto-sacramental ordination towards Trinitarian communion, as we find in contemporary Catholic theology. In this respect, Maximus falls short of the kind of sentiments in sexual anthropology and marital theology that we've found developed in more recent times, both in the Catholic and the Orthodox worlds, according to which male and female complementarity is regarded as the primordial paradigm of all the sacraments and a married person's path to holiness. And indeed, this path to holiness in these more contemporary theologies is described not just in terms of a kind of generic philanthropy, love of all human beings according to their human nature, nor in terms of a kind of formal moral scheme. But this path to holiness is described in far more particular terms, in terms of the risk of concrete action and choices, and with specific reference to the very name of one's own spouse. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Cooper. The question of marriage is today a question which create many differences, different approaches, and like in the time of St. Maximus and after him, there are people who condemn the marriage as a way of the life which is not perfect, which is obstacle for the love and which doesn't lead people to God. We can understand that through the explanation of thoughts of St. Maximus, marriage is not obstacle. Marriage is mystery in the church connected with Christ. And although we encounter sexual differences in our human nature, there is no difference between us, because we are one Adam, we are one nature. So thank you again for your words, for your thoughts, and after all those three papers, now we have opportunity to ask, to discuss, or to tell our personal thoughts connected with the topics we have heard. We have here Bishop Athanasius. He Oh. Please. Mikrofon ne radi, ali potreban je mikrofon zbog... Je li ima nešto od tehnike? There is no translation. We need translation because of the speakers.
Yeah. Somebody can offer a translation? Yeah.
It's dead.
Mislim da se kod Maksima patos ne iscrpljuje ovim opisom i da je to na svoj način jednostavno. Pre svega postoji apsolutna pozitivna Maksimova ocena patosa. Na primjer, paskomen je lumen i theos. Ovde patos, theosis, oboženja, nije ni pasivna, niti je negativna konotacija. Znači, ljudsko biće kao stvoreno ima neku patos. To je dar Božji, koji nije negativan, nego je sposobnost participiranja, zajedništa i ljubav je također svojevrsni patos. Ali to da nadilazi taj ograničeni pojam patosa. To je jedno. Drugo, što se tiče tehnike. Mislim da bi tehnik i tehniki, pa i Maksimo ne razlikuje to. Premudos Božja je nazvana tehnitis. Umetnik. To su karakteristike Hristove. Dakle, da kažem prosto, pojmovi izrazi, posebno kod Maksima, uvek trebaju biti shvaćeni kao prevazilazeći same okvire dotičnih reči pojmova. Time se ne negira njihov sadržaj, ali u isto vreme ne zarobljuju se u same reči izrazi. Da bi na to rekao naš dragi
Thank you for that. I absolutely agree with respect to pathos as a gift of God. I think in some ways that's precisely the point of my paper, that it is in fact the way that God is fundamentally revealed to human beings and to the created order. My question with respect to techne, and I fully acknowledge that I'm taking it in a limited sense, but I'm restricting it to how Maximus uses it in the passage that I quoted, Ambiguum 45, where he's clearly referring to human techniques of making clothing, quite literally building houses, and then more generally of constructing ways of living that are, and I don't mean this pejoratively, artificial, that have to be shaped and made. And, you know, painting an icon is an art. It's a beautiful thing. And yet, on some level, Maximus envisions a transfiguration of all artifice on the human plane, in a human way. And so the question is whether or not the typical modes of artifice, which come to their fore in what we call technology, precisely obscure the gift of pathos for us, so that in some way we are cut off from receiving it as a gift. Rather, we always experience it in a negative sense, which His Grace has very rightly cautioned against. So thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Mikrofon dajte, ovdje ima.
It's working now. Yep. No, needs a new set of batteries. Just speak.
Yeah, just get up and speak.
Yeah.
So I would like to make a question to Dr. Papanikolaou. I'd like to make a comment about the dual character in Maximus psychology. On the one part as the synopsis and cause of all virtues, and on the other part as a specific particular virtue of thymos, of the irascible element, while fear and danger are particular vices of the irascible element. So I would like to ask if we can also use a theory of metathesis or transformation where a man uses the same natural property or natural power and potency like the thymos or the irascible element, and then by changing orientation, which is an existential event, one can use the same power to transform fear and anger into love. And so if we could also take advantage of this part of Maximus' power, so as to make a dialectical.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I understand it fully. I know that for Maximus, love is not something. It's not so much that. I mean, each of the faculties of the soul have a certain kind of power to it, right? There's a certain kind of dynamis, and I think that it's not so much that there's a kind of replacement of love. That you replace fear and anger with love. There is a kind of transformation. So there's a sense in which what you're trying to do is not put in a different kind of thing there. You're really trying in some sense to, and this very much relates to Father Joshua's talk in some sense, right? You're really trying to, in some sense, transform in a very kind of singular way and have all the faculties kind of work together in a kind of singular way, the power that is inherent to each of the various faculties themselves. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, or one thing that in the world of ethics, there's a big debate now about whether anger is justified or is always corrosive. I side with the fact that it's always corrosive.
You're not a friend of Lactantius.
No, I'm not. I don't think anger is ever good. I don't see why you need anger to fight against injustice. I could never understand that. So even if anger does motivate you to fight against injustice, okay, but one could fight against injustice without anger. So I think that Maximus would be on the side that anger is never good. So it's always for me, anger is always a sign of what's wrong with me, right? Not necessarily what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with me. So.
Oh, we have a lot of hands now, but I've seen first.
From the University of Southern Denmark, it's Tokyo University. My question is to Father Joshua. So I will use the example that just happened with the microphone. I get the question already, but it's just demonstrated the reason I'm going to use. So is there any, can we construct a theological approach, or can we define a theological approach to technology? And I don't mean the obsession with technology, I mean the necessity to deal with its failure. Actually, technology fails on every day, every single second. What just happened is not not accidental. It is part of our lives on every single day. You know, with the cell phone, with the computer, with the lights. So can we define an ascetical dimension in our approach to technology? We just have to bear with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good initial answer to the question, because it precisely shows the limitation of technology, and is a sense that reveals our own pathos itself, both with respect to the technology that we constructed that didn't work and is outside of our control, and just showing that you're far away from me, I can't hear you very well, I need this microphone so everyone can hear me. Limitation. I'm kind of reminded of what Father Maximus said last night. Failures of translation actually reveal the genius of the original. And so a failure of technology can reveal the genius of God's techne in the world that doesn't fail in the same way as our technology does. So I think it's a very good point. And more generally, I think the theology of technology, the beginning, I guess, is what I'm trying to do, simply to get the question framed correctly and get it related to our asceticism. It is actually an ascetical question. Technology can obscure our ascetical practice, but I think inevitably, if our ascetical practice has any theoria with it, it has to be engaged with technological reality. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Please.
Macedonia. My question is for Dr. Cook. Thank you for your presentation. And at the very beginning, you mentioned about some new researches or new studies of Maximus the Confessor where they're trying to harness his thought about the question in the 21st century about the division between male and female. Are you by any chance maybe referring to a Harvard dissertation written by one Cameron Partridge on the transfigural transformation of the sexuality of Maximus the Confessor? If that is the case, I would like to ask how to interpret his claim that the fifth division between male and female really does not come from the same logic as the other four divisions. He even quotes Father Andrew Loud, saying that there is not an archetypal cleft of sex within Maximus the Confessor. So I would like very much to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, thank you, Costa. I was not referring to that Harvard dissertation, but I've only just become aware of it through conversations with Joshua yesterday, and I'm very keen to follow that up. I referred to a number of more minor studies in the fuller body of this text. But it is the five divisions are rather curiously ordered, and in fact the fifth one, and the common feature in all five of them is that humanity sort of stands between the two dimensions of the realms that are divided. You know, the uncreated, the created, the intelligible, the sensible, etc., as you come down the list. But the male and female division appears, it seems to me, almost curious. It seems that you could insert two or three at least further orders within the divisions, and the male-female division would appear further down. Is it a cleft or is it not? I argued in my book on the body and Maximus that it was not, and yet Maximus does use very strong language. He uses not just distinction, but he uses difference and division to refer to this sexual difference. He uses the language of the fact that this difference will be expelled in the singular humanity represented in Christ. So he uses very strong language with reference to this male-female distinction. He excludes it as being part of the primordial logos of human nature in God's mind when he first created human beings. So, or when he first had in mind to create human beings, shall we say. At the same time, I think there are some clues in that ambiguum which allow us to, well, if you like, respond to Maximus with Maximus. I'm comforted by the very last line of that ambiguum, which says, what has been said, let it be approved by your philosophy, or let something better be searched out and declared by you. So Maximus opens the door wide to an alternative proposal or to a qualification of his proposal. He clearly doesn't propose it as definitive by any means. Remember that the whole passage is a comment on Gregory's line, "The natures are instituted afresh," which is, it crops up a lot in Maximus's writings and is profound. And what is profound is that the key to understanding this natures are instituted afresh is the virginal conception and birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. And it seems to me that you have already there an acknowledgement of a fundamental role played by sexual distinction. We're talking about motherhood, a virginal motherhood, a supernatural motherhood, but a motherhood from which is conceived and born not simply a generic human being, but a male. And so implicit within Maximus's reasoning, it seems to me, is a theology of sexual difference, a positive theology of sexual difference, which can be articulated to provide an alternative reading of this distinction.
It's a mystical marriage, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Thank you. Father.
Thank you for your papers. I found all of them excellent, but I'm glad. So let me repeat, thank you for your papers. I found all of them excellent, but I'd like to raise a question addressed to Professor Palau. And it has to do with the question of war and just war theory in relation to love. My understanding is that just war theory is not a triumphalistic kind of glorification of war. It's a very pessimistic kind of approach, which nevertheless recognizes that in some cases, perhaps, given that we live in a fallen world, to have a war might be a better option than not to. To give an example, on the 1st of October, the great British historian Eric Hobsbawm died, and on the following day, many obituaries in European newspapers mentioned something that he has famously said, namely that he said that he disagreed with the First World War because 20 million people died and it wasn't worth it. But he said, I'm not sure the same applies to Second World War, where 50 million people died, but perhaps if Hitler had prevailed, things would be much worse. And of course there is violence in war, but sometimes there is a lot of violence in a totalitarian regime, an oppressive regime, in tyranny. So yes, I mean, ideally, peace and love are first and perfect choice, but given that we live in a fallen world, and given that Christians are members of political societies and they have to make difficult decisions and difficult choices, and sometimes love is taken into account before reaching choice A or choice B. I think the matter is far more complex, and we really need a lot of wisdom and a lot of discernment in order to decide whether this or that course of action is justified or not.
Yeah. Thank you, Father Demetrius. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to clarify too. I don't think in applying Maximus the Confessor's understanding of virtue to let's call it the ethics of war discussion broadly. I didn't mean to delegitimize, right, the efforts or the thinking about just war theory. I didn't mean to do that. And I need to be clear about that as I kind of continue to write about this. I mean, I think, and I didn't mean to either to delegitimize the ethical discussions about discerning the proper rule in particular context. I mean, ethics needs rules. So I think, and I do think that one of the strengths of the just war tradition, and this is a very big topic, like why didn't we in the Byzantine period develop such a thing and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a very big kind of topic.
people attribute a lot to Augustine about just war theory. In Augustine's entire corpus, he has like one line about just war theory. But I think that I've been convinced too that, as you say, that the tradition developed out of necessity really and has had an effect in some sense in creating, in kind of keeping, at least creating some kind of amorphous kind of criteria about the justified uses of violence, right? And I think that discussion is important and needs to continue to happen. I would say, however, strongly that what is absent in the thinking about war within the just war tradition is, and I think this is an ethical concern, right? Because in talking about this at another conference, someone said to me, well, isn't that more about therapy than ethics? And I don't think so, because if you kind of see, that's the point. In other words, if you look at it from Maximus's understanding of virtue, it's very much a matter of ethics, right? Because in some sense what's happening is, what's not being taken into account is how much violence or the training for violence or how that affects the person's capacity for the relationship with God, right? And that is a matter of ethics. And I think, so I'm happy you give me the chance to clarify. I'm not trying to delegitimize, and I think there has to be more creative orthodox thinking in terms of entering those kinds of discussions, but I do think there's a little bit of a blind spot, let's call it, in the just war tradition, especially in the sense that it can very much create the impression that if and this is what happens with the American military, right? If you're on the right side, when you come back, you're fine. You're on your own. And that's very, very damaging, because, and this is how I think best to understand in many ways. You know, I'm not an expert in canon law, but the canon about soldiers not being able to receive communion. In some sense, it's not so much that they did anything wrong per se, but it's a matter of really understanding the damage that war and violence can do to you in some sense, right? In terms of your relationship with God. Don't think you can now just approach and think that you haven't been damaged. And so I think that's the kind of light that St. Maximus, I think, his understanding of virtue can kind of shed in the broader discussion of the ethics of war. So, thank you.
So, because we have to close, but only one question more.
And also here, the passage, the 12, you said that he had as his symbol covering only the uniform, simple, and constituted virtue and knowledge that pertain the things after God. Is there any connection with the mystagogia here with this monads, actually, to think of wisdom and actual contemplation of virtue as synthesized in prudent wisdom? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to pull something together. It's a very complex question. I guess I'll answer it this way. With the contemplation of nature, I think Maximus is trying to give full play to how we actually experience the world, how we actually come to know the world, as it were passively receiving sense impressions, more actively rationalizing those sense impressions as our minds function imagistically, and then once again passively experiencing the mind being drawn to God, the archetype and cause of all the things that cause impressions in our mind. So you have that on the one hand, which is a kind of, as I said, a kind of technology of cognition. You know, it's just the nuts and bolts, and it's all multiplicity because it has to do with sensation and materiality on the one hand. On the other hand, he's also looking for where the contemplation of nature in its multiplicity somehow gives itself over to a more unified vision of God. And it's here that the question of Adam's original state comes into play. In a sense, as I read Maximus at least, Adam knew the world without natural contemplation, and that's what it means for him to be wise. That whatever the mediation there was not our current kind of technological state. And so wisdom for us, which in some ways Maximus will always draw towards embodied action, sort of ethically, wisdom for us is a kind of reflection of this primordial wisdom that did not operate according to what we think of as natural contemplation now. And finding how we move from what we do now, which is a very natural progression, and we can think of it as a progression, how that relates to what is more fundamental to humanity is what Maximus is looking for, because ultimately we have these glimpses in the scriptures. For example, when Moses sees the burning bush, as it were, that is a primordial vision of the world, as Adam would have seen it. So finding how the relationship between what we do now and that possibility is what he's after. I know I didn't answer your question, but that's what I can, I think, say towards it. So,
thank you. Unfortunately, we have to close our discussion. Thank you for so fruitful discussion, and of course, thank you all three speakers. And just one information. You can find outside papers before every session, papers of all speakers in English and in Serbian, so you can take it if you like. And please to keep the program. We have now break coffee until 11:35. Please be on time here.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
They all kind of